1 minute. Take your time. We're in prep here, no worries. The presentation is good to go also? Yes, perfect. Do you have any clip or something that could be used here to change the slides? It's here? Oh, it's here. Perfect. There you go.
There you go. Feel very powerful.
You will have to, yes.
Brilliant. Do you want me standing, sitting?
We are live. Very well. Well, it turns out that it's time for us to connect the water community with the net zero governance agenda. So when we were curating the day, there were many topics for us to touch upon, but then we realized there are some gaps within the community that we also need to pay attention to. And today we'll talk about net zero, but there's one point that we miss. We still have the link to governance that we need to cover. We need to understand it better. So, my name is Ines Breda. I am from Grundfos, and I was one of the curators for today. We will today have a session of half an hour to 45 minutes where we'll approach this conversation, the key trends in net zero governance tailored for water sector actors, and do a deep dive into the role of standards as a key strategic lever for accelerating change in net zero. So I have with me Emily Faint. She is a net zero policy manager for the British Standard Institute, BSI, and a convener for the ISO Network Zero Guidelines. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Emily. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I will ask you to please proceed with a presentation, and then I will just come up with some questions for us to continue the conversation.
Brilliant. Good. Well, actually, it is now the afternoon here in Dubai. Good afternoon, everyone, and to everyone joining online. Thank you very much for having me. As mentioned, my name's Emily Faint. I am the Net Zero Policy Manager at BSI. And what this session is really about is trying to set out the rapidly evolving governance changes in the net zero landscape, which, as we know, is probably one of the most blistering paces we see in the development of climate governance here at events like COP and throughout the year. And what is so critical from a climate perspective is the interdisciplinary focus. We cannot have different silos within climate of mitigation, adaptation, resilience, biodiversity, water, ricocheting off on their own without reference to each other. Good net zero requires awareness of water and vice versa. And so what I want to do here is really set out some of the key changes that have happened over the last few years to make sure that this community is also empowered to get involved and to raise these really critical concerns around water to make sure that the net zero governance agenda is not developing without reference to it. So the first thing I wanted to do is actually talk about just, again, what do we mean by net zero? Because the term is bandied around so much that it's actually sometimes hard to know if when we use this term, we're all referring to the same thing. So if this is not a concept you've seen before, I want to break net zero down in terms of the 7 stages of action, which is based off research from the University of Oxford on credible attributes of net zero. And good net zero means the awareness, it means a full journey of action, not just the stages that we often see the most reference to, such as target setting and reporting. Good net zero means making sure that at an organizational level, you are considering how your entire organizational governance is orientated around net zero. So not just do you have a public commitment, but for example, do you have someone on your board, a CSO, who is empowered to make decisions around your company's decarbonization and making sure that investments are being made now rather than delayed till later. Measurement, I'm sure I don't need to explain. Do you actually know what your credible emissions baseline is? Do you know your starting point from which you will need to decarbonize, and do you have the tools set up to measure that and collect that data? The one that you are probably most familiar with, target setting. Do you have a science-based target that will reflect your ability to actually reach a credible net zero by 2050 or earlier? The important bit, the one that we often forget about, the actual emissions reduction stage, which again we rarely see reflected enough in formal governance. Do you have an emissions reduction plan to help you actually implement that target that you set? Possibly the most controversial one of the net zero governance agenda, the role of removals, or as they're sometimes referred to, offsets. What technologies are you using, or nature-based solutions you're implementing to make sure that you are also dealing with residual emissions in a credible way and not conflating that with reductions. And then the last, but often most important ones, reporting, making sure you are transparently communicating your net zero journey and that you are considering wider implications of it. So what often falls into the impact stage of net zero are things that can sometimes be treated as an afterthought of the policy landscape, but we want to see them become a much more normative consideration in net zero action. So that is considerations of a just transition and fair share. How are you accounting for the fact that others may have less resources than you? Are you accounting for your historical responsibility? Are you accounting for a just transition for your workers and upskilling? Are you accounting for the role of nature and biodiversity and not just, for example, planting, setting up wind turbines everywhere and thinking that that's the only thing you need to do without considerations on nature? All of these stages make up what we call credible net zero, and that word credible is something I'll be speaking about a lot later in this discussion. The big question we're talking about today is, how is the net zero governance landscape changing? And this is such a complex question that we will break down further in a moment. But I wanted to introduce you all to a concept that you may not be aware of, which is called the net zero governance conveyor belt model. And this is a model that I honestly think I wish I could show to everyone at COP, because this is so applicable to so many areas of climate action. I believe very applicable to the water landscape as well. What this sets out visually is the way in which governance in climate is changing, and in this case, it's applied to net zero. So over here, you see the role of voluntary initiatives, orchestration campaigns, and ambitious non-state actors. So this probably refers to actually many of you here in this room. If you are in an NGO, if you are in a campaign like, say, the Race to Zero or the Race to Resilience, or if you are in an ambitious business that is calling for change in your sector and trying to lead the way by example, you belong in this stage of the conveyor belt model. You are the ambitious leaders pushing the frontier of what good looks like. And that's incredibly powerful, because without that advocacy and without that best practice, we couldn't actually move this governance landscape forward. However, what you don't have is the ability to bind action. You don't have the ability to mandate action and actually to scale it in a uniform or coherent way. That is where the role of the international standard system comes in, which we'll speak about more in a moment. The role of the international standard system is to scale action across sectors all over the world. So ISO, the International Standards Organization, of which BSI is the UK member, has government-appointed national standards bodies in almost every country in the world. And the point of that is that criteria that is agreed in the international standard system can be scaled into all of those countries and across all of those sectors. And it's actually something that ISO is already working on through its ISO climate commitment, known as the London Declaration. This is a commitment to revise all 25,000 standards, regardless of what they're on, in line with the Paris Agreement to reflect climate considerations in all standards. And then finally, at the far end of the conveyor belt model is the role of national policy and regulation. And you'll see quite fittingly this arrow on the far left marked COP. So COP is often this big political moment in the governance agenda where the huge surge of ambition and momentum and spotlight on things culminates in big steps forward, such as the announcement of the Loss and Damage Fund, or big commitments from institutions that have previously never stepped into the foray. And the conveyor belt model says that we need to work together in governance to make sure that those who are pushing the frontier of best practice are scaling that criteria through the international standard system, because it connects directly to policymakers and regulators in every country in the world. those institutions are the ones that are slowest to move but have the power to mandate action. So if you are looking at how you can scale the calls to action you're giving here at COP, it's incredibly important to understand these levers of change in the global governance system and identify which ones you may not be engaging with. Because if you are, for example, not engaging with the international standard system, then you may find that your criteria will remain bottlenecked in this advocacy space in global governance. So I'll pause there because that's something that we're going to dig into in far more detail. And perhaps the final point we can get into is, of course, standards policy and regulation, and where has this conveyor belt model and this convergence led us up to now.
Oh, thank you, Emily. A round of applause, please, to cheer up here the room. Thank you. I think we'll take a sit. We'll try to understand, have a conversation here one-on-one. So I was having a pre-meeting with Emily today. We found time today. We've been trying for 3 days. And it turns out that Emily is new to the water space. And
True, that's true.
And
I'm newly inducted. Thank you for having me.
I'm new into net zero, so we have here a common point of trying to understand each other's world. So that's where we'll stand. I have here a couple of questions, and hopefully I'll be able to understand and learn a little bit more by the end of the session today. So we can, from my understanding, this is something that just evolved rapidly over the past 4 years.
Yes. I think we're all aware, of course, of the landmark Paris Agreement in 2015 that sort of set this first ever international legal framework to bring all parties in the UN together and commit to limiting warming to 1.5 and well below 2, which is really the framework through which a lot of net zero work and governance develops around. But of course, agreeing, as I quote Professor Miles Allen of the University of Oxford, whose original research coined the term net zero, when he said, well, the way we got the world to agree to net zero is not really agreeing what it means. So even though the Paris Agreement was and is a phenomenal step forward for global climate action and mitigation, our work wasn't done. So a lot of the developments that have taken place in the last 4 years in particular have been this ratcheting up of momentum and ambition towards actually clarifying what net zero means, not just at the global level, at a Paris Agreement level, but actually distilling it down into what that means for individual organizations. And that is particularly, again, key for implementation of net zero. So some of the key changes I would really highlight is, of course, the creation of the Race to Zero campaign, the UN-backed campaign that is the largest orchestration campaign in the world on net zero, which, of course, has its sibling Race to Resilience campaign as well on adaptation and the key topics within that. And the Race to Zero has something like over 13,000 members. It covers around 50% of global GDP. And that has been a really key example of how momentum and the normalization of net zero considerations at a non-state actor level have really accelerated in this space. This has then seeded further momentum towards actually setting benchmarks or tools for organizations to take forward. Because the idea of the Race to Zero is to say that non-state actors have a huge role to play in implementing net zero. It is not just the role of governments. We all have a role to play. But then how do you actually quantify what that looks like and set that out? That's then how we've seen major developments such as the Carbon Disclosure Project developing the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI, as many of you may know about it, which is popularly considered to be one of the most prominently used voluntary target setting standards by businesses right now. And then a final development that I'd really like to point out, or two final ones, is the development of something called the ISO Net Zero Guidelines, which was the first step in the formal international standard system to define net zero and actually stitch together this fragmented landscape of lots of different campaigns, tools, and initiatives. It's not a certifiable international standard at this stage, but you can see how the momentum bleeding down from the Paris Agreement, the campaigns building around it, have seeded this permission for formal institutions to actually define net zero and take action and start to say, this is what organizations around the world need to do.
I have too many questions in my mind right now. I'm going totally off script. So how, because I heard you say race, how do we make sure that in that race we leave no one behind? How do we do it?
It's a great question. I mean, I think when I hear a question like that, I think immediately about the concept of a just transition. It's something that, again, is often talked about at the high level policy discussions, but actually it's a critical consideration that we need to embed in the organizational level. There is no methodology, a quantifiable methodology that exists, certainly that I'm aware of, and I would be delighted to be proved wrong, that sets out how we can quantitatively check that we are embedding fair share and a just transition. But the ISO Net Zero guidelines certainly set out key considerations, such as acknowledging whether you have greater historical responsibility in a space and adjusting your strategy accordingly, considering the relative resources you have in place compared to others that need to transition, and also making sure that we consider what we call core human needs. So remembering that this is not a financial exercise alone or an operational exercise alone. We are transitioning for the sake of humanity. They're doing this to meet human needs and to build a livable future for ourselves. So any organizational consideration of net zero, or indeed anything else, should have people at its heart. It should be a people-centered transition. So not leaving anyone behind means making sure that we have tools and guidance that has had input from everyone, not just typically global north-dominated institutions. It also means making sure that any guidance and action is underpinned by capacity building. So have you given the resource to people to implement what you're asking them to do? And have you considered that different people will have different starting points, and that you need to help bring them with you, rather than just, as we've mentioned earlier, have benchmarks to meet and chastise people if they're not meeting them as quickly as you want?
And how, a lot again, but where are the spaces of conversation in which all of the different voices can actually be heard, so that this communication happens? Where is this communication happening currently?
This communication in terms of governance or just transition? So
the set of standards and the practical world of companies and water utilities, where are we converging? Where do we talk?
It's a great question. So at the moment, my honest thoughts are this is still happening in too many siloed pockets. But again, as the conveyor belt model shows, and as some of the examples that you've seen on the screen show, it is going in the right direction, and more convergence is happening. I would say that these conversations are taking place, I would say, on two key levels. One is at the UN level. So the UNFCCC's role is to be a convener and facilitator of climate action dialogue. So many processes are convened by the UNFCCC itself that have public consultations behind them. I know this seems like a silly thing to say at COP28, but if you're not actively watching consultations or frameworks being developed by the UNFCCC, I urge you to make 2024 the year that you start. A good example I could give of this is in 2022, when the UN Secretary General appointed a high-level expert group to look at the problem of greenwashing. And this group of experts met with, I think, I'll be misrepresenting their numbers, but I think hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of organizations all over the world through virtual dialogues, town halls, and issuing public written consultations. Now, whether you think these things are well promoted enough to get sufficient engagement is obviously is your opinion, but there are open public channels where you can speak directly to seniors in the UNFCCC and say, my concerns are not being reflected here, and I want you to take this into account. And the output of that process is what you can see on screen, which is the landmark Integrity Matters report, which I do urge all of you to go away and read if you want to understand how the net zero governance landscape is thinking of itself right now. Because it sets out not just what key criteria is, but also some name check some of the key institutions that need to play a role here. So by engaging with these processes, you can make sure that your institutions and your calls to action are considered in these wider UN publications. So the UN is obviously a key forum to engage with. The next level of conversations where I think this is happening is also, again, still largely driven by voluntary initiatives, those on the right-hand side of the conveyor belt model. So these institutions have huge convening power and huge ability to make calls to actions to governments. So I think even some of the partners I see sponsoring the Water Pavilion would be examples of this. But if you are not connected into the institutions that are the big voices of advocacy in the water space, make sure you are. But make sure also that those institutions are connected to the major advocates in the net zero space. Because as we said earlier, as you widely pointed out, we can sometimes sit in our interdisciplinary silos. We can sometimes think, I'm a net zero person, I only need to talk to net zero advocates. I'm a adaptation person, I only need to talk to my adaptation counterparts. Actively go and join consultation processes and dialogues with institutions that you don't normally engage with. Because as we know, we can't have net zero that doesn't consider water.
No.
And we can't have water that doesn't consider the need to reduce emissions.
Exactly.
So having each other in our dialogues and in our consultations, I think is a really key thing.
Okay, if we can try to be, if you could give some examples, looking forward to the future, some changes will happen. What would be your advice for the water community to what to look for?
So going ahead in 2024, I would put one key thing on your radar, which is the publication of the UNFCCC's Recognition and Accountability Framework, otherwise known as the RAF. This is due to be published by the UNFCCC in Q1, so that's sometime before March. This is a report that seeks to operationalize some of the recommendations of the Integrity Matters report, which will set out, we expect, what the UNFCCC thinks different institutions should mobilize around to make clear data and transparency for climate action operational all around the world. So that is an ongoing conversation. The ongoing operationalization of the Integrity Matters report is the thing that I would say the water community needs to look for. The other level I would say that you need to pay attention to is the changes in the international standard system. So I mentioned two key things on the slide prior. One is the ISO climate commitment. So this is the commitment to revise all international standards in line with the Paris Agreement. Now, this includes standards on water. So if you are not engaged with your national standards body in the country you're based in, you will not necessarily be able to get involved in this process. And I think it's really key that we have as many experts as possible involved in the international standard system so that the implementation of huge commitments like the London Declaration can be turbocharged and can reflect everyone's expertise. The other development that you would be interested in is also the ISO Net Zero Guidelines, which does name check the role of water, but doesn't necessarily go down into the details of some key considerations that I know this community wants to see reflected on the global governance agenda. The ISO Net Zero Guidelines are something that often is converted into a recognized international standard. And so this process has not begun yet. So if you get involved in the international standards system through your national standards body, you can become a voice in a climate standards committee that can make sure that any further development of net zero standards that will link to this global governance landscape are accurately reflecting the role of water in this consideration. And finally, I should stress that there may be standards in water that don't exist yet that may need to. And by getting involved in this space, you can be one of the leading voices in helping to standardize key calls to action and key concerns for the water community to make sure that this is something that every organization in the world needs to think about and has a clear roadmap of how to implement.
Thank you. Those are very concrete points of action that I'm really happy to have on tape so we can rewatch it again and again to know what to follow for the next couple of years. I will open the floor to the audience if there are any questions. And here it's really about bringing people together. So if there are any questions with regards to gaining new understanding or further understanding of net zero governance, now is really the time. So I'll open the floor. If there are any questions, please just raise your hand and I'll keep my eye out there.
And I should say up front that there are no silly questions because it's a very, very complex and fast-moving
Austin
landscape.
has a question.
So if you want me to repeat anything, please don't be afraid to ask.
Perfect. Yeah.
I have a question, and you may have started to answer this.
Should I just give you the mic? Sorry, Austin. I have a 2-meter tail here.
I think, Emily, this is incredibly helpful to see this laid out. And you started to mention this, and I just need it repeated several times to get it to sync. Many of us in the room are working with water and wastewater utilities that are not necessarily corporations setting standards that standards like SBTI fit well for. And so something we're hearing from utilities is it's hard to align their commitments to a standard. How should we as advocates of water utilities be engaging in the standard setting, or how can we direct utilities as they make commitments and be better partners for them?
Perfect. Great question, Ashton. Here.
That is a really great question. And again, it's a good example of where certain aspects of governance are running further ahead than others, and we need to make sure that we are properly integrating all of these considerations. So I would say that depending on who you mean by we, if you are sort of a leading NGO or advocate for these organisations, then making sure you're involved in these standards committees is key. But as you've sort of begun to answer yourself, making sure these companies themselves are engaging with standards development, because standards are developed by market consensus. So if these water utility companies say, we need this is what good looks like, that voice will be carried in a committee and could actually further develop and refine the criteria that existing standards have, or if there is a gap, create new standards where none exist. I think another point that I would probably make is that this is less in your control, but more of a wider pattern we're seeing, is that more and more convergence is happening between different standard setting institutions. So the ISO Net Zero Guidelines is a great example of where lots of different leading standards, organizations and voluntary initiatives in net zero came together in one process to co-author a single set of guidelines that set out, say, the role of SBTI, the role of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the role of institutions like ISSB, all in one framework. And we're seeing more and more standards bodies make announcements, even just this week, saying we're going to connect our initiatives, or we're going to work together and drive interoperability. So that hopefully will help make the landscape clearer and clearer for these utility companies, but it doesn't replace their own advocacy for themselves and their own involvement in standards committees. So I would say to them, as mentioned earlier, depending on where you're based in the world, find out who your national standards body is. So iso.org/members, there's the whole list there, and apply to join the committee most relevant to your concerns. And that's how you can start to flag these things that maybe are not currently reflected in existing standards.
Great. Thank you. Any more questions from the audience with regards to the topic? Yes, Josh? Sorry. I have 2 meters here. You have to help me out.
Okay, thanks. So we have some internal questions, but I wonder if you can explain, if you can go back a few slides to the first one with sort of the 7 steps. Yeah, there. So essentially, what are the actual types of activities that you're talking about? So if I'm thinking from a water perspective, that's what we would think about, like what would be the water impacts or things that you're trying to measure in the reduction activities, like are they all standard, like energy efficiency measures or switch to energy? And then the big one, I think, is the removals, you know, where water would be there. But it would be, yeah, it would be a little bit useful for me and maybe everybody to understand, like, what are those actual actions that are measured? Is it only a standard set list then we can sort of check off, or is it everything under the sun?
Sorry, Emily. I'll just wait a second. There you go.
I presume that the context of that question is it in something like the ISO Net Zero Guidelines, or are you talking about in general? Yeah.
In the guidelines.
Sure. Sure. So, I mean, you actually gave some great examples already, Josh, of things like energy efficiency measures, but also, in particular, a big thing from a net zero perspective is Scope 3 emissions. So the vast majority of most organizations' emissions will lie in their value chain. So a lot of actions that the guidelines talks about and most good practice tools talk about for reductions is about how you are engaging with your suppliers and how you are making sure that your procurement of products and services you need to deliver your work is conscious of emissions reductions. So that's why a lot of the changes we're seeing right now in governance is looking at instruments like procurement to help companies implement actions and activities like this so that they can start to measure not just their own emissions, but the emissions that they are responsible for across their whole value chain. But I think the point you're getting at, which is what are the water considerations of some of these activities? The guidelines do give you a list. There's a quite a long list of recommended activities that organisations can take. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't specify that organisations should consider the water impact of each of these actions. It does say later on that these actions should take into account the role of critical systems such as water and food security, other critical systems, but it doesn't specify an activity by activity level, that level of granular detail of what the water considerations are. And so this is again a great example of where net zero governance agenda needs to have greater join up with water, and how we need to make sure that there are more water experts getting involved in the development of these standards, but also the other points I mentioned, such as key UN reports setting out what good looks like on mitigation, and also the development of any regulation around this criteria. So again, it sort of goes back to that call to action of if you're not seeing the criteria and these considerations that you are really trying to raise up the agenda reflected, do start to take active interest in these net zero consultations and standards development processes, because that's how we can bring these two key worlds together.
Perfect. Great answer. Could you just go back to the slide of the 7 steps? I'm just thinking that it would be really interesting to develop what this would look like for water utilities. You had the same idea at the same time, right?
I think that's a fantastic idea. I really do. And again, applying these models to key governance issues in water as well, because I think the net zero landscape shows so much fragmentation of lots of different tools and groups and initiatives, each solving one aspect of the problem. So lots of standards that address target setting, lots of standards that address reporting, some that address removals, but nothing would stitch together the entire landscape of action until the ISO net zero guidelines. And we're, 8 years on from the Paris Agreement? So even in the net zero space that is surging ahead in many ways, it's still taken quite a long time to get this far. So the more that we can solution share and share frameworks between our communities to help bring this knowledge together in one, the better.
Perfect. Unless there are any more questions from the audience, no, I will close the session. Are there any things on your slides that you want to revisit or add on?
So I think that I want to sort of summarize some key points, because we've hopped around the journey a little bit here. The key points I want this group to take away are that voluntary action and initiatives have been the key actors driving best practice and innovation to date. So if you belong to one of those groups highlighted, you are going to be one of the key voices that are raising the concerns of water up the climate governance agenda. The next key action is that if you are one of these people, please get involved in the development of international standards to make sure that criteria is scaled across the global economy, because this is how policymakers and regulators in different countries can refer to your criteria and have the confidence to start embedding them into policy and regulatory frameworks, which is how we move from voluntary action alone to, where necessary, some mandatory action. And also, I want to make sure that all of you are aware of this document, the ISO Net Zero Guidelines, which you can download from iso.org/net zero. This is a great example of what it looks like when we stitch together lots of different aspects of governance into one, and to consider whether there is merit and a need for something similar in the water space. And finally, I want to also make sure that you're aware of some of the work that we in BSI are already doing in water. We are already about to publish some mapping of all of the different criteria that we're finding across the water stewardship space to see whether that's something that the standards landscape should be paying more attention to. And we also have an existing reporting campaign that we've launched with WaterWise to, again, raise the role of sustainable water use up the climate governance agenda. That is our Thirst for Change campaign, which you can go and find and read yourselves after this event. And if you do have any questions for us, I'd like to say on the net zero side, please do come and talk to me or get in touch with me. My email is there, or you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. Or if you are interested in engaging with some of our water experts, my colleague Leslie Morris-Iverson's details are also on screen, who would be really happy to speak with you all after this. So let's make today the beginning of closer collaboration and dialogue between the net zero and water space, and do come and help us make this clearer than ever in the international standard space. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think this will be the conclusion remarks. Yes, please. I felt that there was a need of a clap. Good. Thank you so much, Emily, for being the link between net zero and water. I think that we live with some ideas. I'm actually looking forward because I feel that after this day and after the COP in general, we'll have an aftermath meeting and we'll have to assess what we should continue, what is the next step. So this is something maybe to bring up in our wrap-up session. Thank you. It has been a pleasure for me to be the link point in the conversation. If you have any more questions, you are welcome to contact both of us to continue the conversation. And I will invite you to join us at 1. We'll have now a lunch break, and at 2, to join us for a roundtable discussion on how to bring net zero closer to water utilities. Thank you so much.
Thank you.